All right, ladies and gentlemen, one more time. We're still just a few minutes away, but what we're going to do to kind of start grinding the gears is Mr. Flanagan of the business department, who is one of our featured panelists this evening, is going to talk a little bit about his experience doing business in China. So that'll get us a little bit talking about the issue, kind of what it means with the U.S., and kind of his own personal experience working with China. So please, Mr. Flanagan.
Good. Thank you, Kevin. I've lived in Mexico and Venezuela and Vietnam and also China. And I think of the four, certainly China is the most intriguing and the most interesting and the most complex place that I've ever been. So to work there, I lived and worked there, and it is very hard place to do business. The Chinese don't think the way a Western business person does. They think very differently, and their objectives don't really tie in very well with Western culture. So to do business there, if you really want to do business, and I was in the computer business, which at least made it a little bit more simple because everybody needs computers. So it kind of got past the point of whether they wanted to buy from you or they wanted to buy from some other Chinese company, which in general they couldn't do. So they pretty much had to buy from Western companies. And my company was Digital Equipment Corporation, which went from being a standalone company in Massachusetts, then became part of Compaq, which then became part of Hewlett-Packard. So I dropped out of that somewhere along the line after Compaq acquired it and before HP acquired Compaq. But doing business in China was very unique, and they never felt like it was time to stop negotiating. So if you negotiated something and thought you had an agreement today, tomorrow they'd be back at the table to negotiate further because they just didn't ever stop. Now, if you set a price here for the next year, all they wanted to do was start there and work on getting a better price the following year, which meant that you were constantly being pressured to reduce your prices and to take less of a profit on your products. They certainly wanted quality in their products. There was no question about that, but they wanted it absolutely dirt cheap, and didn't really believe that in order to make a good deal, you had to have both parties feel good about the transaction and where you got to. They never felt good about where they got to. They always wanted more, and they always wanted to do more in the coming periods to try and get a better deal. So it was a very sometimes difficult thing to just say, no, we're not going to negotiate anymore. That's the deal, and we're not going to go any further than that. And you can either walk away from the table or you can stay and do business on those terms, but we're not going to do anything further than what I've just proposed. And that becomes a pretty difficult discussion. But we had to do that many, many times. And the advantage, as I said, because I was in the computer industry and we had exceptionally good products, was that they always wanted the products. So they would have to give up on pricing in order to get them. And that really riled them. They didn't like that idea, but that's how it really happened. But the Chinese, starting in '49 when the communists took over, most of Asia is actually, the business communities in most Asian countries are run by expat Chinese. who have moved into places like Malaysia or Singapore or Indonesia, and they will actually take over the business operations in those countries and run them. And the natives of those countries just sort of back off and let the Chinese take over. The Chinese have been exceptionally successful in business, not only in China itself, but also in all of Asia. And they're pretty formidable to be doing business with, whether you're selling to them or buying from them. Yeah, sure.
All right, so how did your experience doing business in China impact the way you did business elsewhere in Asia?
Well, because in many cases you're dealing with expat Chinese in these other countries, you are pretty much on the same, talking about the same kinds of things with them as you would talk about in China itself. So always trying to drive a very hard deal and to always come back and back and back for more and never really give up. So doing business in pretty much all of Asia where the Chinese got into business, you wound up really working the same issues over and over again. Yes?
Did you know this going into China, or is it something you learned the hard way, their characteristics?
Well, a little of both, but really you don't learn anything until you're into the business, and then you wind up learning what works and what doesn't work. Yes?
During the 80s and 90s, when I was in China, I found that 80% of my problems were political in nature. What did you do?
I felt the same thing. I was doing business with, I was trying to set up a joint venture in China, and the guy across the table from me kept pulling out a little red book and saying, it's all here. This is what we're doing, and this is how we're going to do it. And I said, well, I don't have a little red book, but no, that's not how we're going to do it. So yeah, I found a lot of political stuff, although in the computer industry, again, less politics, I think, than in some other industries. Any other questions or comments?
When you say joint venture, did the Chinese stipulate a particular percentage of ownership?
It was going to be 50-50. Yeah, and I was negotiating with the same organization that runs all of their satellites. They were very high tech. They were very sophisticated in their technology, and they knew what they wanted, and they knew how to get at least half.
And any of your counterparts studied abroad?
Let's see. Yeah, some did. There were some who either were in the States or Australia, some in Singapore. So yeah, they did get out of the country to see what else there was out there.
Do you have any restrictions selling computers to the Chinese from the U.S.?
Oh, very much so. And in the computer business, there are certain limits of what kind of equipment how much power you can sell to various organizations, and particularly in China. And we were self-regulating, which meant that the government relied on us to know who we were selling to and what we were selling them, and to keep track of that machine through its entire useful life. And I remember in one case, we sold a machine to a university in Beijing, and when they called to have servicing done on it, they said, it's here. And here turned out to be their rocket research center about 1,000 miles from Beijing. And we said, all right, we can fix that. We can fix that machine in Beijing at the university where we had originally placed it. But we can't get there for about 3 days. In the meantime, they moved the machine back up to Beijing. And so we serviced it there. And I'm hoping that it didn't disappear again and go down to the rocket place. But yes.
Did you live in China?
I did live in China, yes. I had an office in Beijing and I had an office in Hong Kong. And so. And this China organization was also responsible for Taiwan, which was an interesting problem because of the relationship between mainland China and Taiwan. But they let us get away with that because they too thought that it was only a matter of time before Taiwan is going to come back and no longer be a wayward province, and that would become a partner or a part of the mainland China once again.
Just to follow up, what was the time frame?
When was I doing all of this stuff? Well, I was doing business in China in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. I lived in China in the late 90s. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
How did you get involved with the company that you worked with in China, and what made you move there? How did you take that?
Well, for a long time, I had worked at corporate headquarters in Massachusetts, and I worked in both the treasurer and for the controller, corporate controller. And then over time, you move around, you do different jobs, and so I would leave corporate headquarters and I'd go out into some of the operating units and be out there. And China happened to be, the China division was one of those operating units. And I just thought it was a great place to actually learn something and to do something very different than I would have done had I stayed in the States and in Maynard, Massachusetts, where the headquarters was. Hi there, how are you? Jim Flanagan.
Hi, Jim. Tom Hankin, nice to meet you.
All right, everybody feeling China business now? All right. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming tonight to our last Alexander Hamilton Society event of the spring 2015 semester. My name's Kevin Lair, and I have the privilege of serving as co-president of our chapter. My lovely co-president, Aidan Sultanova, is here in the front row, and thank you for being out there in the cold and rain and waiting for Dr. Mencken. Thank you for that. So before we dive too much more into tonight's program, I'd like to highlight the incredible success our chapter has achieved these past few years. At this point last year, the first year that we were fully a club on campus, our chapter was ranked 40th, right near the bottom of all the chapters in the United States. This year, we're proud to say that our chapter has advanced to number 7th in the nation, which I think really speaks volumes about the kind of organization, the programming, and the events that we were able to host on the campus. Throughout this academic year, we've hosted scholarly discussions on ISIS in Iraq and Syria, U.S. immigration policies in the 21st century, and the threat of a nuclear Iran. Tonight's program continues in pushing forth, strong academic discussions of these international issues of economic, security, and foreign policy importance. So throughout this evening's program, entitled The Rise of China and the Potential for a Cold War with the U.S., we'll discuss the rise of China, the current state of relations between the U.S. and China, and how we can prevent a major conflict between the two nations. Our star panelists will explore and discuss these matters, and I will share some personal findings from my senior thesis capstone experience. So thank you all, especially for being here and to hear a little bit about that. So it was only fitting to focus the last event of a club that I helped establish on this campus to devote it to my thesis topic. And to conclude, we will open the floor up for questions from the audience following our structured question period. A few personal thank yous to Dr. Prudhomme, our faculty advisor, and the director of the WAC Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture, the co-sponsor for tonight's program, as well as the other the other three events that our chapter has hosted this academic year. His schedule did not allow him to be here with us tonight, but he certainly sends his best regards and warm wishes. We'd also like to thank our panelists here tonight. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Thomas Mencken of the U.S. Naval War College, as well as Washington College own faculty member, business lecturer, Mr. James Flanagan. So please join me in thanking our participants and all of the people and organizations that went into making tonight's program possible. And lastly, before I join our panelists to moderate and share some of my own thoughts on the panel, I encourage you all to add your name and email to the list in the back of the room, and also include some ideas that you have for future Alexander Hamilton Society events. We were lucky to have a lot of encouragement about the kind of events to host this year, and we'd like to continue to host events that students, that faculty and staff, and of course our friends in the community to continue moving forward. So with that, I thank you again for attending, and I'll now join our panelists who will introduce themselves and their backgrounds on this topic. Let's start with Dr. Mencken, who will set the stage of current relations between the U.S. and China, and why in the first place we're even having this discussion about if there's going to be a Cold War. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin, and apologies for being late. It's always a pleasure to leave Washington, D.C., but one of the challenges anytime one leaves Washington, D.C. is the traffic. And unfortunately, because I teach on Wednesday afternoons, I had limited ability to get out any sooner than I could, and I won't say anything about my speed coming here, but I got here as fast as I could, as fast as a V8 would take me. So it really is a pleasure to be here. It's particularly a pleasure to be here at a Hamilton Society event. As somebody who, not that many years ago, took the train up to Princeton for the first of the convocations of what became the Alexander Hamilton Society, and as a member of the board of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the society, it's wonderful to see it not only existing but thriving at a wonderful place like Washington College. Kevin's put me in the unenviable position of introducing myself and stating my credentials. I will say that I've come at this. First off, I come at this not as an Asia expert. I would not presume to call myself an Asia expert. My field really is in strategic studies, history and international relations, although I've certainly have been spending more and more time looking at Asia over the last 15 years, although ironically the first piece I ever published a number of years ago, many years ago, was on Asia. It's one of several topics that I pay a lot of attention to. It's a topic that U.S. strategy, Sino-American relations, is a topic that I've had the pleasure of studying. During my time serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning in the Pentagon, I had the pleasure of advising two Secretaries of Defense on strategy and planning issues, including issues on Asia. And now, thankfully, as a recovering policymaker, because you are always in recovery, you never quite get over it. As back to a teacher, it's something that I'm able to look at with a little bit more distance. I guess to start us off, I would reflect on just the terms with which we talk about these things. So, tonight's conversation, the potential for a Cold War with the United States. I'll do the academic thing and first sort of unpack what we mean by Cold War. To my mind, when we talk about Cold War, first, we tend to talk about Cold War as capitalized, right? The Cold War, or what I would say the U.S.-Soviet competition, which lasted for a number of decades. But what we're really talking about is several things. We're talking about a long-term competition. Let me parse those words. We're talking about a struggle for influence, in which deterrence plays a strong role, and a competition that is contingent. So let me just say a few words about that, and then hopefully that'll spark some discussion and some debate. So first, I said a long-term competition. What do I mean by that? Well, competition certainly isn't the same thing as cooperation, but neither is it the same thing as conflict. So what I would have you envision is a line where one endpoint is cooperation and the other endpoint is conflict. And when we talk about competition, we really are talking about something in that gray middle zone. To go back to historical analogies, the Cold War was not itself a war. In some ways, the term war was misapplied, but neither was it peace. And so when I think when we're looking at Sino-American relations, are there elements of competition there? Yeah, there are. But that doesn't mean that there aren't also elements of cooperation, and we certainly should hope that competition doesn't turn into conflict. I'll come back to that in a minute. Second, long-term. I think we are talking about a long-term competition. I think from the Chinese perspective, that competition already stretches back several decades. To the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. We could talk a little bit more about the signposts as they appear from Beijing, but at least from China's view, that competition with the United States has already been going on for several decades. From a U.S. perspective, I don't know that there's a consensus that we're in a long-term competition. It's much the views are much more varied on our side. Third, deterrence, right? In a long-term competition, deterrence figures heavily. We seek to deter conflict, and we seek to deter aggression and aggrandizement. Now, in the Cold War, capital C, capital W, that deterrence, was not just of a conventional character, but a nuclear character as well. And certainly, both China and the U.S. are nuclear powers. But if you relax the nuclear part of deterrence, you can look at past long-term competitions that have featured deterrence as a heavy element of the competition. Whether we're talking about the competition between Germany and Great Britain in the late 19th to the mid-20th century, competition between the United States and Imperial Japan in the 1920s, 1930s. Going back even farther, since we're here at Washington College, the competition between Great Britain and the United States, which after all led to at least one war and the burning of Washington, D.C., or the more familiar Cold War, the U.S.-Soviet competition. Just mentioning those competitions, though, I think leads to my final big point, which is just because a relationship is competitive doesn't predict its outcome. So yes, there was a long-term, Anglo-American competition, but it was one that was resolved amicably for all concerned. The Anglo-German competition, not so much. It led to 2 world wars. But along that spectrum, actually, the U.S.-Soviet Cold War was an intermediate case. It didn't lead to a general war between the United States and the Soviet Union, although it did lead to wars on the periphery, and American servicemen lost their lives, the Soviet servicemen lost their lives too. So I would hope for an eventual outcome closer to the Anglo-American competition, but in the spectrum of things, an outcome closer to the U.S.-Soviet competition is preferable to the alternative of the outcome of the Anglo-German competition and a general war. Thanks.
All right, so Mr. Flanagan, could you introduce yourself, your kind of studies on China, and describe to us what we mean when we talk about the rise of China?
I went to Georgetown and Harvard Business School. went to work in the computer industry after I got out of grad school, and immediately started working around the world on computers and in the computer world. Initially in the finance department and then later in general management. In terms of, and also in China itself. So when we talk about the rise of China, I think that it's pretty evident that from an economic standpoint that the country has grown from virtually nothing 30 years ago with Deng Xiaoping taking over from the Gang of Four, which was Mao's wife and her friends after Mao died, that China has taken a completely different economic course, and instead of being just a basket case, it decided to reestablish itself where it had been about 100 years before, when it was in fact the largest economy in the world. And it just decided that it had kind of missed the boat for about 100 years, but it was now, starting in 1949, back in competition to start again a 100-year marathon to end in 2049, which would be the 100-year anniversary of the establishment of the Communist Party in China, that they would get back into the forefront of being the economic power in the world. And of course, the country that they had to knock off was the US. I think that China is not going to try and overtly challenge the US from a military standpoint, at least initially. I think that what they are going to do is to rely on the economic power that they are bringing to the table to eventually cause the US to just kind of let the balance shift in their direction, and that they're going to take over as the lead economic power in the world. As they do that, they're going to introduce and have the rise of their own culture and power in the world. They've already started in the form this week, this month, of establishing their own development bank that they're going to lead, an Asia Development Bank, which is going to challenge what's going on in the U.S. with the World Bank, U.S.-led World Bank, and they're going, and IMF, and they're going to take over and try and compete with and complement the World Bank and IMF with their own banking activities. So I think it's going to continue. I think over the next 20 or 30 years, I think that there will be continued economic and cultural clashes between the U.S. and China during its continued rise to the top. But I don't think that they're going to put themselves in a position where they're going to challenge us militarily, because I believe they think that they can, in fact, rise to the top without it ever coming to a military conflict.
All right, so Dr. Mankin, so Mr. Flanagan was touching on, kind of the future and how there may be, eventual military interactions. What role and what impact do you think the U.S. pivot to Asia and all this talk about, the deployment and the continual rotation of troops, in Asia, what impact do you think that has had on fueling tensions between the U.S. and China?
Well, so I'd say a couple things. So one is, I think there's been a long-term realization across presidential administrations that Asia's strategic weight is growing. You can go back to key policy documents, go back to 2001, the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review, which says pretty much what I just said, that Asia's strategic weight is growing, and talked about, even then, 14 years ago, shifting U.S. force posture and U.S. basing to privilege the Asia Pacific region. And in fact, even before the Obama administration announced the pivot, now the rebalance, a majority of U.S. naval forces were so the recognition of Asia's increasing importance is a long-standing one, and that is in part because of the economic trends that were just discussed. It's also because of recognition of military trends, that a majority of the world's military spending is in the Asia Pacific region, and of course it's also recognition for the United States that we have both territory in the Asia Pacific region, and also allies, and also an interest in maintaining the free flow of goods and information across the global commons. So if anything, I would say that the pivot and rebalance is really a response to longer term trends. And if anything, an attempt to bolster U.S. presence in an increasingly important region. So I wouldn't say it's a cause, I'd say it's actually a response.
And, as we're talking about all this rebalancing, potential military clashes, the economic issues, how would we know whether we are in a Cold War? To what extent, can we kind of define, what would it take to define what a Cold War would look like between the two countries? And building off of that, you often hear that the only thing we know about a Cold War between the U.S. and China would be that it would look different than the last Cold War. So how would we know if we got there? And do you foresee, this is a question to both of you, do you foresee us reaching a Cold War-like state within, say, the next century?
So look, if we think about a Cold War in the terms that I laid out a few minutes ago, in terms of a long-term competition, one side has been competing for over 20 years, and they have been competing in terms of investing in military capabilities, a good chunk of Chinese military modernization, that are really aimed specifically at undermining elements of U.S. military power and pillars of U.S. presence in the Western Pacific. I think we are only now starting to think in competitive terms and starting to respond. So I guess a long-term competition, first thing is you need to have both sides competing. One way that I think that it would look a lot different, or is likely to look different than the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, and I think it gets to part of the reason why we have difficulty thinking about these terms today, is the Cold War was both highly dangerous but also very simple. And why do I say that? I say that because it was dangerous because of the existence of large numbers of nuclear weapons on both sides. In fact, even today, Russia is the only country that can truly annihilate the United States. China can't do that. But it was also simple in that we had a strategy, the strategy of containment, that really applied across the government. So when I first joined the Defense Department, I was working on technology transfer restrictions. Well, that was containment. It was about containing Soviet access to high technology. My godmother worked for the State Department. What was she in? She was in the containment business. She was in diplomatic containment of communist influence. If you worked for the U.S. Information Agency, an organization that doesn't exist anymore, you were in the containment business. You were about containing Soviet ideology. That's not where we are now with China, nor is that where we're likely to be, right? So by contrast, different parts of the United States, different parts of the bureaucracy have different interests and are arrayed on different places along that spectrum that I mentioned a few minutes ago, between cooperation and conflict. I don't see that ever fundamentally changing, and I don't see that ever going to a containment strategy like we had during the Cold War, where everything is aimed at containment. Last but certainly not least, however important the Sino-Soviet relationship is and Sino-Soviet competition is, it'll never be the only competition that we face, the only foe that we face. Right? The Soviet Union loomed above all other conflicts and all other adversaries I think for the United States for the foreseeable future, however important China becomes, we'll still have to worry about Islamic extremist groups. We'll still have to worry about countries like Iran, and as long as it's around, we'll have to worry about countries like North Korea as well. And I say as long as it's around, its demise has been predicted consistently for 25 years now, still seems to be doing fine. So there'll never be this monopoly over national security planning with China as there was with the Soviet Union.
The Soviet-American Cold War was actually going to be a ground war. It was in Europe, and it was going to be tanks on the ground fighting each other. The U.S.-China conflict, or potential for conflict, is going to be at sea. And their need is to not get encircled, not let the U.S. or any of our allies encircle them. And there's already a beginning of that, because you've got that first barrier of islands on the eastern side of China made up of Japan and other islands all the way down to Indonesia that sort of block in China from becoming what they would like to become, which is initially a regional power and then later a world power. So they're going to invest heavily in a blue water navy, one, to maintain their supply routes coming out of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, around Singapore, and up into their Chinese ports. So this is going to be a very different kind of a war, a Cold War, than the Russian one in the form that it's going to take. So their first effort is going to be to try and break out through those islands. And right now, the way they are set up, the islands are all acting as a barrier against China from being able to move out into the open sea, whether it's in the Pacific or the South China Sea, to be able to be free to do whatever they want. So I think that what's going to happen is the first thing that's going to go is Taiwan. And I think it's going to go, unfortunately, without a military effort on the U.S.'s part to try and defend Taiwan from the Chinese. I think it will, in fact, just turn over, because the power of the country is going to be so great in comparison to the U.S. that there's really going to be no feasible way of stopping them from taking Taiwan. Beyond that, I think there's probably a better chance that we will try and stop them militarily or economically or any other dimension that we're talking about. But I think that Taiwan is going to go first, and I think it's going to go without the U.S. really putting up any real defense. And all of this is going to play out on the water. There's going to be just waterborne, whatever conflicts there are, and I'm sure that there will be airborne conflicts. They established a no-fly zone over most of the South China Sea and said, that's all ours. You can't go in there without telling us that you're going to go in or fly through it. So I think that there are serious air problems right now that's going to result in conflicts in the air between the U.S. and China forces. But the real battle is going to take place on the water.
Because I think you made a number of excellent points that sparked some additional thoughts. I mean, I think that, look, the geographic dimension of this really is key, which is, I mean, this is a competition in many ways between a continental power, China, and a maritime power, the United States. Now, China is a continental power that is seeking to go to sea and is expanding seaward, and that's, in fact, what really concerns us and really concerns our Japanese allies and really concerns many of China's neighbors in the region. But we shouldn't forget the fact that the reason that China has been able to expand seaward is because she's enjoyed quiet, peaceful borders, by and large, on the Asian continent. That could easily change. As a matter of fact, I would go out on a limb and predict that it will change. But China's move seaward really has triggered a counter response. And so now, in fact, part of what you're seeing with Xi Jinping's economic development strategy, in a way, is sort of a return to continental Asia and greater involvement in continental Asia. And frankly, I think that's something that we should welcome. Because it's less threatening to us and to our allies, and it's actually apt to cause more challenges for China. On Taiwan, I hope to be not quite so pessimistic for a couple reasons. One has to do with trends on Taiwan, and I think one has to do with trends in the region. I mean, the trends on Taiwan, I think, point more and more towards a separate identity from the mainland. It's clear in demographic trends. It's expressed in political trends. I think the gambit that Beijing has been betting on in recent years is increased cross-strait economic ties and social ties would lead to closer political cooperation. In fact, the opposite's happened. You talk to Taiwanese, if anything, it's reinforced their separate identity. So I think politically, the will for unification, reunification is declining. You're right, it could be just a brute use of force and, quite frankly, a lack of American will that could lead to a bad outcome. But I wouldn't bet on either. And certainly there are plenty of things that Taiwan can do to enhance its ability to defend itself. In the 21st century, as in the 20th century, launching an amphibious operation across a large body of water, and the Taiwan Straits, are wide, is tough. And increasingly, military technology favors the defender. So I think if the right investments are made and with the right political will, then that negative outcome, which is a possibility, could hopefully be avoided. So.
Well, I'll take it as the fact that I addressed a number of these issues in my thesis that hopefully I was on the right track. Let's try to transition a little bit from the security and political standpoint and more shift it to a kind of an economic conversation. So, throughout my thesis, I really analyzed, the role that economic linkages and interdependence play in preventing conflict between the U.S. and China. Interdependence theories of the larger liberal paradigm suggest that, the symbiotic relationship between countries of mutual dependence, that, countries that are highly dependent on one another would be less inclined to participate in conflict or go to war with one another, given the huge impact it would have on each nation individually. So I was discussing throughout my thesis some of the economic impacts and the linkages, and I really examined the work of a professor of political science and international studies, John Peefhouse at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who analyzed interstate conflict with a focus on how economic linkages either increase or decrease conflict between states. And building off of that, I took the theoretical and the empirical data, the theory behind economic interdependence, and the data of what's going on between the U.S. and China, and try to apply and see really was economic interdependence, preventing conflict between the two countries. So what I did was I conducted an original analysis of 15 major events between the U.S. and China, focusing on how during the period from 1979, when we developed diplomatic negotiations with China, until the present, the last event analyzed was when Xi Jinping took power in China. And over the course of this time, I analyzed how the economic dependence between the two countries dramatically deepened. During the same time, I analyzed in 10-year increments these 15 major events and coded, using an original coding, I coded these events based on how they increase, decrease, or maintain the level of conflict that was currently in play. And what I found was striking in that over the course of these roughly 35 years of 15 events, the level of conflict remained constant. What I found was that overall, as Peefhouse found in his research, that as economic linkages and economic interdependence strengthen and deepen between two countries, you would expect and you find an increased number of events with the potential for conflict, but what he found was that actual conflict decreased. What I found in my research was that the level of conflict between the U.S. and China has remained steady. So that kind of makes you wonder whether economic interdependence is preventing the level of conflict from increasing, if it plays any role at all. So if either of you would like to take that and kind of discuss what role economic linkages and interdependence play in preventing such a conflict between the U.S. and China.
I think that there can be both. Both can exist at the same time. I think we can be both economically interdependent and also have conflict. I don't think that one is exclusive of the other. I think that for many years what's happened is that the U.S. has in fact been trying to help China and has worked really hard at trying to drag China up by its own bootstraps to a level of world power, and that it has done so with our help. And I think it's only just recently that we have begun to think, whoa, wait a minute, I don't think we're ready for this. I don't think we're ready to give it up. And so I believe that the economic relationship that we've had with China could continue, and I think we could continue to buy a lot of product made in China, and we could continue to have them invest in treasury bonds, but still wind up in conflict or in competition with them for world dominance.
Yeah, so first to agree with one point and then to kind of build on it. I mean, the bedrock prerequisite for globalization is the predictable flow of goods, materials, services across the world, right? It's what has really allowed globalization. And no country has benefited more from globalization than has China. Well, what has permitted globalization? Well, it's actually U.S. hegemony, U.S. military power, primarily U.S. naval power, which has guaranteed free flow of goods and materials across the global commons. So, right, in a very fundamental way, China's economic prosperity today is attributable to U.S. hegemony and the U.S. Navy, among others. To the broader point about economic, I would agree with Kevin's initial point, which is, yeah, I think it's true that economic interdependence reduces the propensity or the possibility of conflict. So do other things, right? So you could argue that nuclear deterrence also reduces the propensity or the possibility of conflict, but it doesn't prevent it. Great Britain and Imperial Germany on the eve of World War I were highly economically interdependent with one another. Their royal families were related to one another to boot, so there was a very, very familial form of interdependence there as well. But in the end, the stakes were such that those relationships were secondary to the conflicting objectives that the two sides held. So, and in fact, in other cases, economic interdependence has sparked conflict, right? U.S. planning in the late 1930s counted on Japan's dependence on imports of raw materials to act as a deterrent. And hence the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration put embargoes on raw materials to Imperial Japan as a deterrent. We now know that, in fact, that helped goad the Imperial Japanese government into launching the December 1941 phase of the Pacific War. So sometimes economic interdependence can actually spark conflict. In the end, it's all about politics. It's all about political objectives, the value that the two sides attribute to those political objectives, and the lengths that they're willing to go to achieve those objectives.
So Len, let's branch out a little more. What role do kind of international institutions play in preventing, conflict between the U.S. and China, like the UN? Now the development of the, Asian Development Bank, just seen as rivaling the Western-dominated World Bank. What role do these institutions play in kind of keeping both sides grounded and preventing conflict?
I think that they can do some good but I don't think they can prevent the conflict between China and the U.S. that will ultimately appear. I think that they can delay it. I think that they can push it out. I think that on a temporary basis they can help to manage it, but I don't believe that either party is going to rely on international organizations to accomplish the peace.
I think that's right, and those those institutions are largely our creation, the creation of us and our allies, and that's fine with me. But it's probably less fine with the Chinese Communist Party. It's why they're seeking to create alternative institutions, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the AIIB. I'm actually skeptical that that those types of alternative institutions really can be true alternatives. And I actually think the U.S. government, speaking personally, I think the U.S. government made a strategic mistake by making such a big deal out of the AIIB, particularly when we couldn't stop, or even in my view, it wasn't even in our interest to stop our allies from joining it, because after all, it's an institution that has a pittance in terms of budget, and yet we've turned it into this big institution, which it really isn't. Better on our side to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership and give folks a real alternative.
Let's not forget that the single priority for the leaders of China are the maintenance of the Communist Party in charge of the country. And they will do anything in order to stay in power. So if they think that the U.S. or anybody else is in a position of trying to unseat them, they will do everything possible to stop it, from economic to military, and anything in between.
Yeah. And I would say, I think we'll have a very good test case in the near term regarding the power of institutions. As you see the adjudication of the Philippines and China's claims in the South China Sea. Mm-hmm. If institutions really are all that powerful, when, I'll say not if, but when there's a ruling in the Philippines' favor, if China respects it and backs down and says, "Oh, sorry," then that would lead me to recant what I just what I said. If you get obfuscation and denial, then that leads you down another path.
Let's talk about the role of perceptions. Because perceptions often play a large role in policy decisions, for example, in Congress. So let's talk about, there's a lot of talk about China's dramatic increasing, military defense increases, the branching out and trying to take over all these islands that may or may not rightfully claim, and seeking to rival the U.S. and the West-dominated institutions and such. What role do these kind of perceptions of what China's doing, and then vice versa, the views of China on U.S.'s kind of encroachment into Asia?
Look, first off, I would say perceptions are extremely important. Perceptions are powerful. Perceptions shape reality, and I think we ignore them at our peril. And if we look at things from Beijing's perspective, things look a lot different. So first, Chinese strategists pay attention to things that Americans basically ignore. One of the things that they pay great attention to is the 1999 Belgrade embassy bombing, where a US B-2 bomber dropped several munitions into the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Just so happened to be the intelligence station of the embassy. which may have magnified the way that message was received in Beijing. Now, it was an accident, but the building that housed the embassy previously had housed a Serb government agency, and that was the real target. However, coming from the world's most sophisticated military, the world's superpower, saying there was an accident somehow rings hollow. I think there's good evidence that a good chunk of Chinese military modernization really took off after this event that's at best a footnote in Western history of Sino-American relations. So I don't discard perception, but of course, but these perceptions are, in a number of cases, have also been manufactured. Right? They've been manufactured by the Chinese Communist Party. So the idea of Chinese maritime claims. The view now is this always has been, always will be part of China. Actually, there was a Japanese press report on it a couple of weeks ago, but actually the information's been out for some time. In the 1960s, early 1970s, official Chinese atlases published by the Chinese government referred to the Senkakus as the Senkakus. Even China's claim to Taiwan, it is at least can be there's room for debate over that. And yet those perceptions have become reality on the Chinese side. The Chinese will claim that everything that they're doing is defensive, and to include, attack on Vietnam in '79, all sorts of it's all defensive. We shouldn't minimize that though. That's extremely important to understanding Chinese motivations and also understanding their will to defend these things. The fact that they see the South China Sea and the East China Sea as defending their own territory leads me to believe that they're likely to fight much harder to defend something that they see as theirs rather than acquiring something that they don't see as theirs. Now, as to sort of the facts, I mean, in terms of increased military spending, yeah, I mean, China has experienced many years of double-digit defense spending. Some of it totally understandable in terms of just modernization of large numbers of tanks and artillery pieces, but a good portion of it focused, as I said before, on chipping away at the pillars of American presence and American power projection in the Western Pacific, and chipping away at the ability of countries like Japan and Taiwan to defend themselves. And that's of concern. Also of concern is the fact that China's aims, again, the perceptions, their aims appear to be growing. So Senkakus being a good case, the fact that the South China Sea is now seen as a core, vital national interest, or it wasn't previously the case. And it does make one wonder where it stops. And I think that is really one of the key questions that American policymakers will have to face in the future. Are we really talking about a dispute over, as people like to say, inaccurately, a handful of rocks in the ocean and over Taiwan, or is it really over something bigger? And my personal view is that it's the latter. It really is over something bigger.
I happened to be in Hong Kong when they dropped the bomb when the U.S. dropped the bomb in Belgrade, and my staff in Beijing said, "Don't come up." And by the way, at that time, there was a 747 leaving every hour from Hong Kong to Beijing, every hour of every day, bringing people who wanted to go do business with China. So they all would start out in Hong Kong, get their visas, and then hop on the 747 and go north to Beijing, about 3 hours. And I think they're still doing it. So they called me and said, don't come up, stay away for the time being. And they called the next day and said, well, okay, it looks like the government has got the mobs under control, so you can come on back up to Beijing. So I went up to Beijing, and I was trying to get to the office by taxi, and the driver said, "You speak English?" And I said, yes. And he said, where are you from? Now, I could have said Canada, or I could have said Australia, or and I said, I'm an American. And he said, I want to practice my English. And he handed me his English primer that he had sitting on the dashboard. And we then, on the way to the office, we, in fact, did English vocabulary that he wanted in order to get ready for the Olympics coming up. So it was a pretty interesting little diversion that occurred around the bombing in Belgrade. In terms of perceptions, I too believe that perception is a much more critical and important to the Chinese than to the Americans. I think that we're more likely to let something that we perceive to be not very good slide. They're not, and they'll act on perception, whereas we probably would not.
All right, and for the last structured question that I have, let's kind of discuss, where we go from here. With the new Congress being sworn in, with the 2016 elections seemingly here every day, what would you recommend in terms of policy towards China moving forward? What would you like to see? What are you afraid of hearing, from chatter? Increased, future sanctions, currency manipulation, issues such as those. What would you like to see moving forward, and what would you recommend to ensure that we're not headed towards a conflict?
I believe that it would be desirable for the U.S. to stop helping China lift itself up to being in competition with the U.S. I think that we ought to stop the aid that we have been providing across the board to them and their government. I think that the only way that this is going to work for the U.S. Is to not help them become a world power. And although they already are, not to help them become an even bigger world power, because bigger means they're going to be bigger than we are and take over our position in the world right now. So I think the first thing I would do is to cut off most, if not all, assistance that we're giving them government to government, or that we're encouraging businesses to give them. And I think that at least it will delay their ability to become the world power for some period of time. I don't think that our government is going to try and fight them militarily. I think that the only thing that China could do to cause the U.S. to react is to try and permanently break out of their continental position in Asia and to try and break out through the islands that we've been talking about to new positions where they're acquiring land, islands in the South Pacific or in the East China Sea, or some other overt activity like that. Otherwise, I think that we're going to just kind of continue along without trying to either help them or hurt them.
I mean, I think there's a number of things that we can do and should do. One is, when it comes to economic relations, we really should stand for standards, transparency, and for good governance. That's why I think, actually, it would have been a smart move for the U.S. to from the beginning say, sign us up for the AIIB. Because a seat on the inside, and seats on the inside for allies like Japan and allies like Australia, give us the ability to stand for standards and stand for good governance and throw a flag or blow a whistle when we see those standards being avoided. Second thing I think we need to do is support our allies. We've talked a lot about the United States and China. We haven't talked a lot about U.S. Allies in the region. We need to bolster the confidence of our allies, such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, but also our friends, to include Taiwan, Singapore, and increasingly Vietnam, to allow them to stand up to coercion. We should also think about ways to complicate China's ability to coerce its neighbors and to act assertively. And that could include causing problems on the Asian continent. It could include efforts to impose costs upon China in some ways to level the playing field, considering that they have imposed considerable costs upon us and continue to impose considerable costs upon us through their military modernization. And to have, in some ways, what you'd characterize as normal great power relations, which means in some cases cooperation where feasible, where desirable, but in other areas competition. And I think through that and through strengthening deterrence, bolstering deterrence, that's our best protection against a failure of deterrence and the outbreak of a real conflict, a real war.
All right, so that concludes the questions that I had for this evening. So now we'd like to open up the floor for any questions you may have. And if we could, we'd like to start with any questions that our students in the audience may have.
So China's demographic future, at least over the next couple decades, has already been written, right? So that there's great certainty, and what you have is a population that is increasingly graying, and a population with a significant gender imbalance, significantly more males than females. Whether that those demographic facts lead to a geriatric piece or a different outcome, I think, is open to debate, in part because it's literally an unprecedented situation, right? So usually, if you think back and look at demography and the causes of war, it's tended to be on the other side, is demographic growth. So here, one can plot out a number of different plausible, alternatives. So one is, the geriatric piece, the idea that, well, you have basically single child families, more sons than daughters, and are you going to be willing to risk your sons when, particularly as in Chinese society today, really they are your social safety net. There really isn't an institutionalized social safety net. That's possible, but China and the Chinese leadership, CCP, have long talked about the desire to see a China that grows rich before it grows gray. And so I think a very good question is, as China gets gray and is not yet rich, how does it respond? Does it go quietly into the night or not? And there are other ways to make up for declining manpower, including technology. So again, the demography is extremely important, and will also affect already beginning to affect Chinese economic performance, but will increasingly do so. But I find difficulty leading that to a single policy outcome.
I think they're already starting to change the demographics. I think they're already moving away from the one-child rule, and they're allowing two. The problem that they're having is how to employ all of them. That's the only constraint that they've got, is how to feed them and how to find jobs for them. But I think that this is something that could change in 20 years with just almost overnight. And I think with their intent of trying to get to 2049 as their 100-year marathon, that they, in fact, long before that time comes, they will have changed their one child per family policy. and run the risk that there are going to be more people unemployed in the country in order to avoid that occurring. Well, I think that that they will suffer that. I mean, let's face it, the Chinese have killed many millions of their own people, many millions, and they're not about to allow the country to go under because of that one-child policy. And so I think that if it turned out to be having more than one child per family, I think that, and with the risk that that's going to cause starvation, I think that they would run that risk. And let's remember that the largest country in the world is going to turn out to be India, not China, which in itself brings in a great dimension about which of the two is really going to dominate and who is in fact going to prevail by the middle of the 21st century. Will it be China or will it be India? My own feeling is that it's going to be India. By population, I think they're already there.
They're getting there. They're getting there.
They're so close that it's not.
And what India has that China no longer has is, or shortly will no longer have, is what's called the demographic bonus, right? So they have more younger people who are working and contributing versus no offense, taking away. Whereas it's much more skewed in China, and India will have that demographic dividend for some time into the future. The only point I would add, and it's not meant to sound snarky, but I mean, look, the Chinese government's already doing a pretty good job of wrecking the environment of China with a one-child policy, just in terms of pollution, disruption of populations, resettling of whole populations. They're doing a fine job of really hurting quality of life as it is, and that actually is a big concern because. One aspect of demography is fertility and a number of males and females of different age cohorts, but the other is kind of quality of life and living conditions, right? So you can see in some ways, I mean, maybe China's future in Russia's present, where actually male life expectancy has actually gone down over two generations, and hasn't gone down solely because of low fertility rates, but also just because of low quality life, lack of prompt medical care, all sorts of things like that. And so, if anything, that's likely to be an add-on effect as the effects of decades and decades of the one-child policy play themselves out.
And certainly, the impact of the environment is going to have a bigger impact on older people than it is on the younger. So it's quite likely that they'll be knocking people off at the upper end of the age spectrum, not at the lower end.
And then the other,
Jackie, I'm not looking at you.
The other part of it too is so Chinese government will say 90+% of China's population is Han Chinese, which even there's question of what that really means, but. You have sizable populations in Xinjiang and Tibet, and there, actually, the fertility rates are significantly higher. Although there's a lot of resettlement of Han into Tibet and to Xinjiang to compensate or to try to really colonize those areas. So you also have differentials between different parts of the Chinese population that are likely to be more significant over time.
Repetition of a lot of money going into science and technology? Well, the U.S., its whole advancement has taken place with technology and with innovation in technology in particular. So, to the extent.
Like the government support for it,
Sure.
The government really, like, the best thing that ever, I would say, the best thing that ever happened to this country was SPUT. Because it's got
Yeah,
going.
got people
And
moving.
It was wonderful. I was so happy to take that, because then we got really serious, and that's one of the things that really contributed to winning the Cold War. But it was really a pretty good war. We didn't, we had Vietnam and so on, but really it was a fairly painless war.
Well,
And the plus side was enormous.
I think there is one thing in contrast to China. The U.S. has got a much better ability, and it can be a better bed for innovation than China does. China's innovation right now, it's getting technology by stealing other people's. So it's not really built on their own innovations. And as soon as they switch to being an innovative country, if they can, I don't think they can, but if they can, I think it's going to become far worse for the U.S. But as long as the U.S. has got it can continue to be the cradle of innovation, I think that we will have another way of staying ahead of the Chinese.
The Soviets, they had a very inefficient, probably more inefficient system than the Chinese, but they had very good science. They
Yeah.
had very, very good science, some of the best in
Yep.
the world. I was very impressed with what they did.
Mhm.
And the thing that really killed them was their industrial production.
Well, for the time being, all of their scientists are coming to the States to study, and some go back and some don't. Some stay here. But they have, yeah, they are. And I think their focus is more on science and technology themselves than they are to try and continue to acquire it from other places.
But I think and on this point, and switching it over to the U.S. side, look, I mean, the United States has an almost unique demographic gift, and that is the ability of American society to attract people from all over the world, make them citizens, and make them part of the fabric of our society within an individual's lifetime. It's truly extraordinary. I mean, if I think of the other countries that are able to do that, Canada, Australia, New Zealand on a micro scale, because there's only 4 million of them, Israel in a very limited way, that's it. Britain can't really do that. France certainly can't do that. Now, to the extent that we don't do that, it's because of bad public policy, right? So we welcome the best and the brightest in the world to come study in the United States, and then we kick them out as soon as they graduate. We make it really hard to move to the United States. We could, and I actually think it would be good public policy, say, look, you're going to come to the United States, you're going to get a graduate degree in basic or applied science. Yeah, comes with a green card attached. Come and stay.
What Germany's doing now is they have very inexpensive university education. People can go to Germany from another country, and they pay like $500
Yeah.
a semester, and then they say they can stay afterwards. So they are really trying to
They are, but citizenship is by blood. So the path to citizenship in Germany is very difficult.
So they might not be
Whereas,
citizens, but they can still stay.
sure,
They can still work there.
sure.
They just want a good standard of living. Maybe they can't vote, but they can.
Sure. But we by our nature are much more welcoming, right? I think.
I suppose, but I think if they start competing, like by offering lower tuition,
Yeah.
things like that, that's, you know, they might decide to do that rather than get $100,000 in debt in a year.
All right, I
You know?
think well, during the summer, I had the privilege of interning with the East-West Center in Washington, D.C., a think tank that deals with international relations between the U.S. and East Asia. And I really focused on kind of those person-to-person interactions and the number of students coming from China into the U.S. and vice versa. And I think that as we've seen each year, pretty much without fault, we've seen an increase in the number of students coming from and to China between the U.S. and China. And in the past, you know, many students always went to Europe as their destination, and they still tend to be among the highest destination choices for students, U.S. students studying abroad. But more and more, we're seeing more students interested in studying in East Asia, and with that, we're seeing more and more economic impact. I mean, for example, we had the East-West Center come to Washington College just a month or so ago, and they were talking about how, you know, what a crucial economic impact Asian students have on the Maryland in particular, on the U.S. So without a doubt, the person-to-person exchanges and the economic impact resulting clearly is a huge factor to think about when it comes to U.S.-China relations.
I also think that it's the Chinese government's policy to encourage students to come to the States and study, particularly the sciences, and that they're expecting that those students are going to return and bring that knowledge back and use it in China for China's benefit.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we are welcoming. I think we should be welcoming, and as I was just saying, I think if anything, we should be even more welcoming, not just for folks to come study here, but also remain here after those studies are over. Again, that's been you know, a key element of American society, American industry, American innovation since the founding. Yeah, I mean, I think it's beneficial. I know. So China, I know, is trying to strengthen its higher education system, and I think in some cases, and this is true of many countries. You know, you can have one premier university or a couple of premier universities. Actually, what really distinguishes the United States above, I'd say, just about every other country is the quality of education. Going, you know, from the first tier down to the second tier, down to the third tier. So somebody said something about California a few minutes ago. So I'm a proud native Californian, and whether it's the University of California system or the Cal State system, or even down into the community college system, it's a very good education. And so it's that depth of education that really distinguishes American higher education. It's really hard to replicate. Look, you know, to take another, Oxford's a fine institution. Cambridge is a fine institution. King's College London is a fine institution. Depending on what discipline you're in, you can go down from there. But even in the UK, there's not the depth, there's not the educational depth that you have here in the United States. I think North Korea poses a real challenge, I wouldn't say dilemma, but a real challenge for the Chinese Communist Party. Because on the one hand, North Korea fulfills a very important role for the CCP. It's a fraternal communist party. The Korean Workers' Party is a fraternal communist party. They will, in some ways, kowtow to Beijing. They will, pay some limited homage to Beijing and to China as the Middle Kingdom. But they're troublesome. They're also nationalistic and don't always heed Beijing's advice and threaten to draw China, whether it wants to or not, into a conflict or even into a collapse if Pyongyang collapses. So I think it's sort of a codependent, battered spouse syndrome relationship. I think that on even days, the Chinese leadership would love to get rid of Beijing, but then on the odd days, or get rid of Pyongyang. On the odd days, well, they don't know what would come after might be worse, and they don't quite know how to do it. So I think it's a real challenge. I mean, Beijing appears to kind of try to distance itself from Pyongyang, but then you have Kim Jong-un, deciding to go to Moscow for the victory parade as a way of, thumbing his nose, among other things, at Beijing. So I think it's a very complicated relationship.
I don't think that North Korea will invade or try and take over South Korea without Beijing's approval, and I don't think that Beijing is going to give their approval.
All right, so with that, I think that this panel has really brought some closure for me in terms of my thesis, and that I feel that I'm finally ready to graduate and can leave, the issue of China and a Cold War here. So with that, please, I welcome everyone to sign in the back, add your name to our email listserv to stay up to date on the events as we begin programming for next year. Thank you all for your questions and your time, and most importantly, please join me in welcoming our fantastic panel.